The Revolutionary War started as a colonial rebellion against the British on the fringes of its empire. It ended with an independent America and the idea of liberty spreading across the globe. All this happened because the rebels won the major battles. We're here to dive deep into each of them. Welcome to the Key Battles of the Revolutionary War podcast, hosted by James Early and Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on key battles in the Revolutionary War. In the last episode, we looked at the big systemic changes that were happening in the world of the 18th century that made the Revolutionary War possible, changes in warfare and weapons, changes in philosophy and humanity's understanding of itself, changes in the American colonies, and changes in the British government policy. Now we're really going to dive into the nitty-gritty and look at the specific things that triggered the Revolutionary War. James, ready to see how Britain mucked up everything in its colonies?
I am ready. I do want to say to the listeners, in a similar way to the way we did the Civil War series, this is mainly going to be about the military part of the American Revolution. If you read any American Revolution book today, they'll always say, well, the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War are not the exact same thing. And that's certainly true. We will primarily be focusing on the Revolutionary War. We're going to look at battles. But having said that, we will also discuss other issues that are extremely important, that we will talk about some politics. We'll talk about what it was like to be a foot soldier in both armies. We'll talk about things like, not as much as we did in the Civil War series, but we'll talk about things like the medicine and the food of the soldiers, and we'll certainly spend some time on the Declaration of Independence and things like that, but mainly military. Now, I'm gonna go ahead, Scott.
And spies too. Let's not forget about spies.
Spies! I can't wait for that. Yeah, that's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
Yes, Scott loves spies, and I do too. So we will definitely. We did not cover that in the Civil War series. We may go back and do something on that later, but we're definitely going to talk about it in this series, and we'll talk a little about naval combat, just a little. But having said all that, I'm going to turn around and contradict myself now by saying we do have to talk a lot of politics and even some economics.
Yay!
Yay!
Spreadsheets.
So try to stay awake, okay, people. So let's go back all the way to the French and Indian War, and I do not want to go into much detail about that because this is not the French and Indian War podcast, but if you want to get a good but not super duper long overview of the Revolutionary War, I'm going to point you to the same podcast that Scott mentioned earlier. He didn't name it, but I will name it now. There's a podcast by a fellow named Michael Troy. He is he's not a professional historian or anything, but he's just a history nut who's been reading about the Revolution all his life. He lives in Philadelphia, and he is a fantastic podcaster, and his series is top notch. Now, Scott and I are going to give you a kind of a undergraduate level course here, if you will. It's going to be fairly basic. We're going to paint with a broad brush, not go into too much detail. If you want more, go listen to Michael Troy's podcast. Again, the American Revolution podcast. It is PhD level. I mean, he has been at it for something like 100 episodes. I'm not sure right now as of the recording. We're recording this in May of 2019. And he hasn't even I don't think he's gotten to the Declaration of Independence yet. But he does a mini series on the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. And I highly recommend that. Really good stuff. So anyway, but after you finish our series. All right. So the French and Indian War basically was a war between Great Britain, in particular the colonists, but there were regular troops, of course, that were sent over, and they fought against the French. And most of the Native Americans or Indians fought on the side of the French. A few fought on the side of the British, but it ended in a British victory. And the French were completely kicked out of North America, at least not counting the Caribbean islands and things like that. But the continental North America, French, gone. So keep that in mind, tuck that away in the back of your head. The French were not happy about that, and they've got a bone to pick. They've got an axe to grind. Let me see if I can come up with some more cliches. But okay, maybe not. But the French are not happy about the fact that they lost Canada to the British and the Mississippi Valley and other parts of North America. So after the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War was over, the British government drastically reduced military spending. I always tell my students that war is extremely expensive and governments almost always have to go into debt, and Britain was no exception. When you go from being on a war footing to a peace footing, a lot of people lose their jobs. So a lot of people who had been employed making arms, making ships, making sails, making uniforms, now they're out of work. And some of these people, a lot of them actually they do move to America and they try to find a living. Between the end of the war, which was 1763, and 1775, the American population increased from 1.6 to 2.1 million people. So think about that. In 1763, we had roughly 1.5 million plus a few, but that increased to over 2 million. So that's a 33% roughly increase. So that's a huge increase. On top of that, Britain was now 122 million pounds in debt. Pounds sterling, the British currency. And today that would be 8 billion pounds or $12 billion. So just enough for maybe one battleship or something, right? In today's money, that the old saying, a billion here, a billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. Right. But back then it was real money. Interest on the debt was 4 million pounds annually, and that was 60% of the regular budget. So the British government is massively in debt, and they've got to find a way to pay off some of that debt. Well, could you just tax the people? Well, maybe, but the British people were already the most heavily taxed people in Europe, and that was not really a good option. They would not be able to come up with the money to pay off the debt. You'd probably have a revolt on your hands. So the Prime Minister of Britain, who was a man named George Grenville, he said, let's have the colonies help out. He said, quote, "We have expended much in America. Let us now avail ourselves of the fruit of that expense." So for the first time ever, Parliament began to levy a series of direct taxes on the colonies. This is a watershed development. It's a huge change in policy. Prior to this, Britain had pretty much let the colonies tax themselves, raise their own taxes. They had not forced the colonists to pay taxes directly to the British Crown. That is going to change, and the colonies are not happy about it. Let's just put it that way.
Well, I'd just like to mention a few things before you get into the nitty-gritty of these. First of all, an important point you mentioned that there's a huge flow of British people to America. When the Revolutionary War happens, we think of it as being universally popular the way World War II is, where 18-year-olds run to enlist to become fighter pilots. It's not universally popular in America by any means whatsoever, and that's due to a new inflow of British, so that's something to keep in mind there. Second of all, I would like to say two things in Britain's defense, since they're not going to look very good here. America does this today, where Britain wants to tax. We're not going to tax our own subjects, we'll tax the colonists. Did you know that if you live abroad, you have to pay taxes if you live in a foreign country to that country and also to America? Because America thinks, well, Americans who live abroad don't have any political representation, so let's milk them for all they're worth. America does exactly what England was doing back then. Third of all, I am probably one of the more pro George III Americans you'll ever meet. He never had a mistress, which for a monarch in the 18th century, that probably puts you in the top 5% of morality.
Yeah, I know. It's like, what? You didn't what?
You didn't have a mistress? What? He was absolutely adored by the British people, so much so that when he fell into dementia and mental illness in his later years, and when he finally died, England was absolutely heartbroken over it because he was so beloved by his people. So I just want to give a little positive nudge to George III before he seems to be absolutely terrible. So take it away, James. Look at Britain's exploitation of the colonies.
All right, so the first serious attempt to regulate American trade on the part of the British government was called the Sugar Act, passed in 1764, the year after the war ended. There had been in the mid-1600s, there had been some laws called the Navigation Acts, but they don't really count because the British never really enforced them. There had been a sugar tax in the 1690s that had set a 9 pence per gallon tariff on molasses. And of course, everybody's molasses, refined sugar, it's syrupy stuff. When the colonists would import molasses into the colonies, they were supposed to pay 9 pence per gallon. But they usually ended up paying 0 pence per gallon because the British government did not try to enforce it. It was too hard to enforce. Smugglers were everywhere. So what the Parliament decides to do in 1764 is to actually lower the tariff. So there's a tariff on the books for 9 pence per gallon. They say, we're lowering it to 3 pence per gallon. So, hey, colonies, you're getting a tax cut. But the colonists don't see it that way because this time they're going to enforce it. They're going to make sure it's being collected, the British government is. So from the colonist viewpoint, it's a tax increase from 0 to 3, whereas the British are saying, no, it's 9 to 3. That's a cut, 9 to 3. Parliament sent over customs collectors and inspectors to enforce the act, but the colonists bribed some of the collectors to not collect the tax, and American courts would not help enforce the act. So in the end, the act proved to be pretty much impossible to enforce. And there was a great amount of opposition in the colonies. Many denied Parliament's power to tax at all. Here's a quote from one leader in Boston, a man named James Otis. Interesting character. He later goes insane, literally. But this is what he said after the Sugar Act. He said, quote, "The colonists, being men, have a right to be considered as equally entitled to all the rights of nature with the Europeans. And they are not to be restrained in the exercise of any of these rights, but for the evident good of the community. By being or becoming members of society, they have not renounced their natural liberty in any greater degree than any other good citizens. And if it is taken from them without their consent, they are so far enslaved." So here we see, for the first time that I'm aware of, it may not be literally the first time, but the colonies comparing themselves to slaves. They're saying that the mother country, Great Britain, is enslaving us, which of course is a very ironic thing to say. And a lot of British leaders did not miss the irony.
As America is importing them wholesale from Africa, yes.
Exactly.
Right.
I forget which British leader it was. Was it Edmund Burke, I think, that said it's awfully ironic. I may have this quoted later, but he says it's ironic that the drivers of slaves cry the most about being enslaved by the mother country or something like that. That's a gross paraphrase, but he had it right. And by the way, let me say, listeners, that we are going to try to be as neutral as we can. And I'm glad, Scott, that you said the thing about George III that you said earlier. When we did our Civil War series, we tried to be as balanced as possible. We tried not to be pro-South or pro-North, but to give both sides perspective in their own words to the extent that we could. And I think we succeeded largely. Most people said we did. We had a couple of comments that said we didn't, but so we're going to try to, I mean, we're definitely in the tank for America on this, but we're going to try to be fair to the British too. The British were not evil monsters. They had reasons for doing what they did, and the Americans had reasons for doing what they did. And we'll try as much as we can, again, to let them speak for themselves. Like I just quoted James Otis. We're going to have a lot of quotes. Most of them won't be that long. Y'all are saying, thank goodness. But we want to let these men explain themselves to y'all as much as possible. And yes, I said y'all, I am a Southerner.
That's right. Representation from all parts. And the next act, to give some context to why they did it, the Stamp Act, again, this is something that I think is recognizable to any American who has been through the public school system, even though you can't remember it. That dumbfounded me when I thought, well, why would that bother people when you tax stamps? And I learned about that when we actually use stamps. For somebody going through public school now, they may have never encountered a stamp before. So what was the idea and what was the controversy behind this particular act?
Yeah, so the Sugar Act dies, and the next year it is replaced by the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act, passed in 1765, required colonists to pay a tax on anything printed on paper. When people would pay the tax, they would receive a stamp to put on the product to show they had paid the tax, kind of like a receipt. Or sometimes they had to print things or use stamped paper. Now, I always ask my students, I'll do it again here in a few months. I always ask